Hey, tonight we explore the forgotten connections between European chivalry and ancient mindfulness practices. As the mists of time part before us, we journey to a world where armored warriors sought not only physical might, but inner balance. In stone-walled chambers and sun-dappled forest clearings, knights once practiced movements eerily similar to what we now call yoga, seeking harmony between body and spirit. These warriors understood that true strength flows from stillness, that flexibility empowers the sword arm, and that breath control steadies the heart in battle's chaos. If you're enjoying this peaceful moment, please like, share, and subscribe. What ancient practices have you incorporated into your modern life? Dim your lights, turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and settle in. Let the gentle whispers of forgotten wisdom guide you as your thoughts wander gently into the past. You stand in the cool shadows of Camelot's eastern tower, your wounded shoulder a constant reminder of yesterday's tournament. The physician has done what he can with herbs and bandages, but the ache persists, deep and stubborn. Dawn light filters through narrow windows, casting golden rectangles across the stone floor, where an aging knight sits cross-legged, eyes closed, breath measured and deep. You have heard of Sir Edmund, once the kingdom's fiercest warrior, now Arthur's most trusted advisor. The stories say he learned strange practices during the Crusades, secrets that kept his body supple and his mind sharp well into his 60th year. You hesitate at the doorway, unsure if you should disturb his solitude. Without opening his eyes, Edmund speaks. "Enter, young Gawain. Your breathing betrays your pain. The chamber smells of beeswax candles and dried lavender. As you approach, you notice the unusual straightness of Edmund's spine, how his shoulders remain relaxed yet strong, how his hands rest upon his knees, with fingers arranged in peculiar formations. You fought well yesterday," he continues, finally, opening eyes that seem to hold depths beyond their pale blue color. "But you carry tension like a second suit of armor. It will slow your recovery." You nod, feeling oddly exposed before this man who seems to read your discomfort without effort. "The physician says I must rest for a fortnight before training again." Edmund's weathered face creases into a smile. Physicians know the body's wounds, but not always its strength. "Sit with me, and I will show you what I learned from a wise man in Damascus, practices older than Christianity itself." Something in his calm certainty draws you forward. You lower yourself to the floor across from him, your wounded shoulder protesting the movement. The stone feels cool beneath you, solid and ancient as the castle itself. "Close your eyes," Edmund instructs, his voice dropping to a resonant murmur that seems to vibrate in your chest. "Now attend to your breath. Feel how it enters your nostrils, cool and fresh. Feel how it warms as it fills your lungs. Feel how it leaves, carrying away what your body no longer needs." You follow his instructions, skeptical but willing. The first few breaths feel awkward, self-conscious, but slowly something shifts. The air seems to move deeper into your body than usual, reaching places long starved of breath. "In the East," Edmund continues, "warriors have known for centuries that breath is the bridge between body and spirit. They call it prana, life, force. The Romans knew of similar practices, as did the Greeks before them. Now, gently raise your arms before you, only as high as feels comfortable with your injury." You lift your arms, surprised when Edmund adjusts your posture with light touches to your elbow and wrist. "Even in this simple position, there are a dozen ways to waste strength," he explains. "A knight who cannot stand properly cannot fight properly. The morning light warms your face as Edmund guides you through movements that seem deceptively simple, yet demand complete attention. You stretch muscles that have never been deliberately stretched before. You hold positions that somehow ease your shoulder's pain rather than aggravating it. You breathe in patterns that make your head feel extraordinarily clear. In battle, Edmund says, as you hold your arms extended, fingers spread like the rays of the sun. The difference between victory and defeat often lies not in strength, but in balance, not in force, but in focus. The greatest swordsman is not the strongest, but the most centered. Outside, you hear the familiar sounds of the castle awakening, servants calling to one another, horses being led from stables, the distant clang of the blacksmith beginning his day's work. Yet within this chamber, time seems to follow different rules. Each breath becomes a complete universe, each movement a deliberate journey. Edmund guides you to lie upon your back. Now, for the restoration of your shoulder. In the body's wisdom, every part connects to every other. We will work not only the injured area, but all that supports it. The floor's hardness presses against your spine, a sensation you've never properly noticed before. Edmund places a rolled blanket beneath your shoulder blade, creating a gentle opening across your chest. The relief is immediate and profound. The body remembers every sword swing, every fall from horseback, every night spent sleeping on hard ground, he says, his voice flowing like water over stone. It carries these memories in tightened muscles and shortened breath. Our task is to help it remember its natural state of ease. You feel an unexpected emotion rising in your chest, something between gratitude and wonder. For years, you have trained your body to withstand pain, to deliver force, to endure hardship. Never before has anyone taught you to listen to it, to work with its wisdom rather than imposing your will upon it. As the morning progresses, Edmund shares more of what he learned during his years in the Holy Land. He speaks of warrior monks who could control their heart rates in battle, of breathing techniques that allowed men to withstand extreme cold or heat, of positions that restored energy after long marches. Our Christian brothers often misunderstood these practices. He explains while guiding you through a gentle twist that releases tension from your spine. They saw them as pagan rituals rather than practical wisdom. But the body God gave us works according to principles He created. Is it not our duty to understand this vessel that carries our soul? You consider His words, finding in them a kind of sense that transcends the usual divisions between faiths and peoples. The movements themselves feel both foreign and somehow deeply familiar, as though your body recognizes what your mind does not. By midday, your injured shoulder feels warm and alive with circulation. The pain hasn't vanished, but it has transformed from a sharp, limiting ache to a softer sensation that seems part of a healing process rather than an obstacle to it. Edmund nods with satisfaction as you roll your shoulder experimentally. Tomorrow, we will do more. For today, I ask only that you remember your breath. When you sit at dinner, when you walk the grounds, even when you lie in bed tonight, return your awareness to the breath. It is always there, waiting to center you. You thank Him, feeling strangely humbled. You've won tournaments and earned praise from the King himself, yet this quiet lesson in breathing and movement has somehow touched something deeper than accolades ever reached. Throughout the day, you find yourself returning to the morning's practice, standing straighter as you cross the courtyard, noticing the tension in your jaw as a senior knight criticizes a younger one too harshly. breathing fully into your lungs while watching the sunset paint Camelot's walls copper and gold. That night, sleep comes more easily than it has since your injury. Your dreams are vivid, images of distant lands, of warriors moving like flowing water, of your own body strong and whole. You wake before dawn, drawn back to Edmund's eastern chamber as though by an invisible thread. He is already there, of course, sitting in the same cross-legged posture, though today his hands form a different shape. He smiles without opening his eyes. Welcome back, Sir Gawain. This morning, he teaches you sequences of movements, one flowing into another like a carefully choreographed dance. The warrior's body must be both sword and willow, he explains. Rigid when striking, flexible when receiving force. These movements teach both qualities. You learn positions with poetic names: warrior's stance, mountain strength, eagle's gaze. Each challenges different muscles. Each requires a specific quality of attention. Some feel impossible at first, your body protesting their unfamiliar demands. Others bring immediate relief, as though addressing imbalances you've carried for years without noticing. Days pass, then weeks. Your shoulder heals faster than the physician predicted, but you continue visiting Edmund's chamber each morning. What began as curiosity has become necessity. These practices ground you, prepare you for the day's challenges in ways that conventional training never did. Other knights notice the change in you. Your sword work becomes more fluid, your endurance improves. In the saddle, you sit with a new stability that makes your horse respond more readily to subtle cues. Even your sleep deepens, leaving you refreshed where once you woke, still tired. 1. Morning. Sir Lancelot himself appears at the chamber door, drawn by rumours of your transformation. He watches silently as Edmund guides you through the now familiar movements. When you finish, Lancelot's expression is thoughtful rather than judgmental. These are not unlike exercises I observed among Byzantine guards, he comments. Though they called them by different names. Edmund nods respectfully. The wisdom of the body speaks many languages, Sir Lancelot. Would you care to learn this one? To your surprise, Lancelot agrees. The next morning, he joins you, his legendary grace, making the movements look effortless even on first attempt. Within days, other knights follow. First the younger ones, eager for any advantage, then even some veterans, seeking relief from old injuries that plague them in damp weather. Arthur himself takes notice when reports reach him of improved performance in training. He visits one morning, standing quietly at the back of what has now become a small gathering. Edmund continues teaching, unruffled by the royal presence. When the session ends, Arthur approaches not with judgment, but with questions. These practices, he asks Edmund, they come from the Holy Land? From beyond it, my king, Edmund replies. The man who taught me was Persian, but he learned from an Indian master. The origins go back thousands of years. Arthur considers this. And they strengthen our knights? They strengthen body and mind together, sire. A centered knight makes clearer decisions in battle. A flexible knight sustains fewer injuries. A knight who controls his breath controls his fear. Something in... This answer satisfies Arthur. He nods slowly. Continue then. But Edmund, ensure they understand that this wisdom complements our Christian faith rather than challenging it. These are practices for the body God gave us, tools for better serving our purpose. As you wish, my king. Edmund bows. After Arthur departs, Edmund turns to you with a quiet smile, and thus, Sir Gawain, begins a new chapter in Camelot's knighthood. From your injured shoulder grows a stronger brotherhood. The seasons turn. These morning practices become as much a part of nightly training as swordplay and horsemanship. You watch as Edmund adapts the movements for men of different builds and abilities. Shorter sequences for those about to travel, gentler variations for those recovering from wounds, more challenging positions for those preparing for tournaments. On campaign, you and your fellow knights practice together before battle, drawing curious gazes from allied forces unused to seeing armored men moving with such deliberate grace. You notice how these sessions calm pre-battle nerves, how they forge a wordless unity among your ranks. In your 4th year of practice, Edmund falls ill. His breathing, once so powerful it could be heard across the chamber, grows shallow and labored. You visit him daily as he weakens, bringing news of how the practices continue even in his absence. On a quiet autumn morning, he calls you closer to his bedside. "It is time for you to become the teacher," he whispers. You protest that you don't have his knowledge, his understanding. He smiles weakly. No one ever feels ready to carry wisdom forward, yet the torch must pass, or the light dies. 3 days later, Sir Edmund passes peacefully in his sleep. The knights gather to honor him, and in place of the traditional vigil, you lead them through the movements he taught, beneath stars that seem especially bright that night. Years pass. You continue Edmund's work, teaching new knights the practices that have become central to Camelot's martial tradition. You develop new sequences specific to different weapons and battle situations. You record the teachings in a bound manuscript, with careful illustrations ensuring the knowledge will survive beyond any single teacher. One spring morning, while guiding a group through the warrior's stance, you notice a young knight struggling with balance. His features remind you of yourself at that age, earnest, determined, slightly frustrated. You adjust his position with the same gentle touches Edmund once used with you. "The body knows," you tell him, echoing words spoken to you long ago. "Our task is to remember how to listen." The young man's face shows the same skepticism yours once did, then the same surprise as he feels the immediate difference in his stability. You smile, recognizing the moment understanding begins to dawn. And so the teachings continue, passed from night to night, generation to generation. This wisdom of breath and movement, of inner strength and outer grace, in stone chambers and forest clearings, in castle yards and battlefield camps, the knights of Camelot practice these ancient arts, bridging worlds and traditions in service of body, mind, and kingdom. When foreign emissaries visit Arthur's court, they often express surprise at seeing armored warriors moving through these disciplined postures at dawn. The story spreads to other kingdoms, where some adopt similar practices, while others dismiss them as eccentricity. Yet none can deny the unusual vigor and longevity of Camelot's knights, nor their remarkable composure in both victory and defeat. In your final years, long after your fighting days have passed, you still begin each morning with these practices, your body remembering what your mind cherishes. Young knights seek you out for guidance, not just in matters of combat, but in questions of balance, between strength and flexibility, between discipline and intuition, between the warrior's path and the seeker's heart. And when travelers from distant lands occasionally visit, bringing their own traditions of mindful movement, you receive them with recognition rather than suspicion, for you have learned what Sir Edmund knew, that wisdom wears many garments but speaks to the same truth, that the harmony of body and breath leads to harmony of spirit, and that even warriors must cultivate peace within themselves. In the great tapestry of Camelot's history, this thread, begun with your injured shoulder and Edmund's gentle guidance, weaves subtly but significantly through the whole cloth, strengthening it in ways visible only to those who know where to look. And in quiet moments, you still hear Edmund's voice. Return to the breath. It is always there, waiting to center you. And now, this story draws to a close. Take a deep breath as we gently move forward in time, into the next chapter of your journey. Candlelight flickers across yellowed parchment, revealing secrets lost to time. Ancient wisdom waits patiently in shadowed monastery halls, where the prayers of monks once mingled with warriors' disciplines now forgotten. You run your fingers along the edge of the manuscript, feeling the texture of parchment that has survived 5 centuries. The library of St. Albans Abbey is hushed around you, dust motes dancing in the beam of afternoon sunlight that falls across the reading desk. As a visiting scholar in medieval military history, you've examined countless texts, but none quite like this one. The Disciplina Corporis, Brother Michael explains, his voice barely above a whisper, despite the library being empty, save for the two of you. The Discipline of the Body. We believe it was written around 1318 by Brother Thomas, who served as physician to the Knights Hospitaller in Rhodes before returning to England. The illuminated manuscript lies open before you, its Latin text interspersed with detailed illustrations of men in various posed positions. What makes these drawings remarkable is that they clearly depict knights, some partially armored, others in simple tunics, performing movements strikingly similar to modern yoga postures. This has been in your archives all this time, you ask, trying to keep the excitement from your voice. Academic discoveries rarely come so neatly packaged, so unexpectedly complete. Brother Michael nods, his aged face creasing into a smile. Hidden in plain sight, misclassified for centuries as a manual on military drills. Only when Sister Agnes, our visiting art historian, recognized similarities to Eastern devotional art did anyone look more closely. You turn the pages carefully, marveling at the precision of the illustrations. Here is a knight in what modern practitioners would instantly recognize as warrior pose, his stance wide and stable. Another page shows a series of backbends, carefully annotated with notes on how they counter the physical strain of wearing plate armor. Still another depicts breathing exercises with detailed instructions on their benefits before battle. May I? You ask, gesturing to the translation notes Sister Agnes has prepared. Brother Michael slides them toward you with a nod. The medieval Latin text, now rendered in modern English, reveals a sophisticated understanding of what we would now call biomechanics. Brother Thomas writes of harmonizing the humors through controlled movement, of strengthening the vessel that houses the spirit, of techniques to maintain vigor in winter campaigns, and speed recovery from wounds. These instructions are remarkably specific, you observe, reading a passage about shoulder mobility exercises. He's addressing problems that would be unique to men wearing mail and wielding heavy weapons for hours. Indeed, Brother Michael agrees. What fascinates me is how he integrates these bodily practices with spiritual discipline. Notice how he quotes both scripture and, quite remarkably for his time, wisdom from Eastern sources. You nod, finding the passage he references. Brother Thomas writes, "As the psalmist tells us to be still and know that I am God, so too did I observe the Saracen holy men finding divinity through the stillness of the body. In this, our differences are as dust compared to our common seeking. Outside, the library windows, you can see the abbey grounds stretching toward rolling English countryside. Sheep graze where knights once trained. The afternoon light casts long shadows from the ancient stone walls, creating a tangible connection to the medieval world that produced this remarkable document. Would you care to see where we believe these practices were taught? Brother Michael asks, noting your gaze drifting outdoors. You follow him through cloistered walkways, your footsteps echoing on worn stone floors, polished by centuries of sandaled feet. The air smells of beeswax candles and ancient timbers. Brother Michael moves, with the unhurried pace of a man whose life is governed by the rhythm of bells rather than clocks. This was once the infirmary, he explains, leading you into a spacious chamber with high windows that flood the room with light. According to Abbey records, Brother Thomas converted part of it into what was called the Hall of Restoration after his return from Rhodes. You stand in the center of the room, trying to imagine it as it would have been 700 years ago. The stone walls would have been hung with tapestries for warmth. The floor, now bare, would have been covered with rush mats. And here, wounded, knights and aging warriors would have gathered to learn Brother Thomas's synthesis of Eastern movement practices and Western medical knowledge. We know that several prominent knights patronized the abbey during this period, Brother Michael continues. Sir William Marshall the Younger visited regularly. So did veterans of the Crusades seeking healing for old injuries and what we would now recognize as the invisible wounds of war. You close your eyes briefly, and for a moment, the centuries seem to thin. You can almost hear the controlled breathing of men learning to inhabit their battle-worn bodies with new awareness, the quiet instructions of Brother Thomas guiding them through movements designed to counter the physical toll of medieval warfare. The manuscript mentions a daily practice at dawn, you recall. Would that have happened here? Brother Michael gestures toward the eastern wall, where large windows would catch the first light of day. The text speaks of greeting the sun with the warrior's salutation. Sister Agnes believes this refers to something quite similar to what modern yoga calls Surya Namaskar, the sun salutation sequence. As you walk the perimeter of the room, you notice subtle marks in the stonework, brackets that might once have held wooden bars or supports. The manuscript had illustrated how some postures use such aids, particularly for knights relearning balance after injuries. How long did these practices continue here, you ask, running your fingers along the ancient stones? That's where the historical record grows frustratingly vague. Brother Michael sighs. Brother Thomas died around 1341, during the early years of what would become the 100 Years' War. We know his immediate disciples continued his work, but references become scarce after 1350. The Black Death, you murmur, naming the pandemic that ravaged Europe beginning in 1347, killing perhaps a third of the population and disrupting every aspect of medieval life. Indeed, many knowledge traditions were broken during those terrible years, he agrees. Though there are intriguing hints that some aspects survived. There's a mention in a 15th century text of the old warriors' exercises being practiced by Henry V's personal guard, and several Tudor-era military manuals reference restorative postures without explaining them, suggesting the knowledge was still present but becoming esoteric. You return to the library as afternoon deepens toward evening. The manuscript seems even more precious now that you've stood in the space where its teachings were once practiced. Brother Michael brings a pot of tea, and you settle in for a closer examination of the text. What strikes me, you say after studying several pages of illustrations, is how practical these teachings are. This wasn't esoteric knowledge for its own sake. Brother Thomas was addressing real problems that knights faced: shoulder injuries from wielding heavy weapons, back pain from wearing armor, circulation issues from long rides in the saddle. Yet he frames it all within a spiritual context. Brother Michael notes, see how each section begins with a meditation on a virtue: strength, balance, patience, endurance, linking the physical practice to character development. You nod, reading a passage where Brother Thomas compares the discipline required to hold a challenging posture to the moral fortitude needed to uphold knightly vows. He's training body and character simultaneously, as twilight approaches, bringing with it the gentle sound of bells calling the modern brothers to evening prayers. You carefully photograph each page of the manuscript for further study. Your mind is already racing with implications for your field. This document could rewrite our understanding of medieval military training, of cross-cultural exchange during the Crusades, of how ancient wellness practices traverse continents, and adapted to new contexts. Brother Michael must read your thoughts on your face. Knowledge is rarely lost entirely, he says with a gentle smile. It submerges like an underground stream, flowing unseen until conditions permit it to emerge again. What Brother Thomas learned in Rhodes, he brought to England. What you learn here today, you'll carry forward in turn. That night, staying in the Abbey's guest quarters, you find yourself unable to sleep, despite the comfortable simplicity of your room. The manuscript's images keep appearing in your mind. Knights in positions of strength and balance, timeless postures that transcend their medieval context. Sitting up in bed, you decide to try one of the simpler sequences described in the text. You begin with the breathing technique Brother Thomas called the Knight's centering breath, a slow inhalation through the nose, brief hold, and controlled exhalation that could be performed even in armor before entering battle. The stone floor is cool beneath your feet as you move through the basic standing postures. Though you have no formal yoga training, the manuscript's illustrations were clear enough to follow. You find your body naturally adjusting, seeking the alignment that feels most stable and open. There is something profoundly moving about practicing these movements in this place, centuries after they were last performed here by men whose lives were so different from your own, yet whose bodies knew the same limitations and possibilities as yours. The connection across time feels almost tangible. Morning brings the opportunity to examine the manuscript once more before your scheduled departure. As you review the pages now, with the experience of having tried the movements yourself, new details emerge. You notice how Brother Thomas adapted what must have been Eastern teachings to address specifically European concerns. Modifications for men accustomed to wearing heavy armor, variations for northern climates, integration with Christian prayer, cycles. I've arranged something special, if you're interested, Brother Michael says, appearing at your side. Sister Agnes contacted a colleague at Oxford who specializes in medieval medicine. He's identified herbs mentioned in the manuscript's recovery protocols and recreated one of the salves Brother Thomas prescribed for use after these exercises. You follow him to a small workshop adjacent to the modern infirmary. The room smells of dried herbs and beeswax. A middle-aged man in casual clothes looks up from a workbench and introduces himself as Professor Williams. Fascinating document you've discovered, he says, gesturing to a small ceramic pot. This is as close as we can come to Brother Thomas's balm of restoration. Comfrey, arnica, St. John's wort, calendula, infused in olive oil with beeswax to set it. You detect a note of skepticism in his voice. You don't seem entirely convinced. About the manuscript's significance, you observe. He shrugs. Oh, it's significant historically, without question. I'm just not sure we should be surprised. Medieval Europe wasn't as isolated from Eastern practices as popular history suggests. Trade routes brought more than just spices and silk. They brought ideas, techniques, philosophical frameworks. The Crusades, for all their violence, were also massive cultural exchange mechanisms. Still, you counter, finding such a systematic adaptation of what appears to be yogic practices specifically for knights seems unprecedented. The adaptation, yes. The underlying awareness of these techniques, less so, Professor Williams replies. There are references in multiple sources to Eastern body disciplines being known in military circles. What's exceptional about Brother Thomas's work is how thoroughly he documented and systematized the practices, and how explicitly he connected them to both martial effectiveness and spiritual development. Your discussion continues through the morning, joined by Sister Agnes, who arrives with additional translation notes. Together, you piece together more of Brother Thomas's remarkable story. His early training as a battlefield physician, his capture during a Saracen raid, the years he spent learning from Islamic and Hindu healers, while technically a prisoner but increasingly a respected student, and his eventual return to England carrying knowledge that bridged disparate worlds. What's most remarkable to me, Sister Agnes observes over a simple lunch in the refectory, is how Brother Thomas frames these practices not as foreign imports, but as universal wisdom that transcends cultural boundaries. He repeatedly emphasizes that the body's needs and capabilities are the same, regardless of faith or nationality, which was a rather progressive viewpoint for the 14th century, you add. She nods. He was careful to couch everything in Christian terms, of course, describing the body as God's temple that must be maintained with appropriate reverence. But between the lines, you can read his genuine respect for the Eastern teachers who shared their knowledge with him. After lunch, with your departure time approaching, Brother Michael takes you to one final location, the Abbey's small museum, where he has arranged a special display. Under glass lies a knight's sword, shield, and partial armor, dating from approximately the same period as the manuscript. Try to imagine, he suggests, wearing 30 to 50 pounds of this, riding all day, then fighting for your life. Then, consider what it would mean to discover movements that could relieve the physical toll, restore flexibility, reduce pain. You study the armor, noting the weight distribution, the restricted movement it would impose, the constant strain on shoulders and lower back. Suddenly, Brother Thomas's detailed instructions for counterposes make even more practical sense. For these men, such practices wouldn't have been exotic or spiritual luxuries, you realize aloud. They would have been essential physical maintenance, as practical as sharpening their swords. Yet Brother Thomas understood that body and spirit are inseparable, Brother Michael adds. His genius was recognizing that physical practices could simultaneously serve martial pragmatism and spiritual development. As you prepare to leave, gathering your notes and photographs of the manuscript, Brother Michael presents you with a small gift, a modern reproduction of one of the manuscript's illuminations, showing knights practicing what we would now recognize as a warrior pose sequence. To remind you, he says with a warm smile, that wisdom has many sources, and that the body's knowledge sometimes preserves what books cannot. Driving away from the Abbey, watching its ancient towers recede in your rearview mirror, you feel a connection to Brother Thomas and his knights that transcends the centuries between you. Their world of armor and swords, of feudal obligations and religious pilgrimages may bear little resemblance to your own. But in their search for practices that would maintain strength, restore balance, and unify body and spirit, you recognize a thoroughly modern quest. Back at your university, you begin the meticulous work of preparing your findings for publication. Each evening, you practice the sequences illustrated in the manuscript, your body learning what academic analysis alone cannot teach. You find yourself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, carrying yourself differently. Colleagues are initially skeptical when you present your research. The notion of medieval knights practicing yoga-like movements challenges too many comfortable assumptions about the rigid separation between Eastern and Western traditions. But the manuscript's evidence is compelling, its illustrations too precise to dismiss, its instructions too detailed to have been theoretical. 6 months later, you return to St. Albans Abbey with a film crew from a historical documentary series. Brother Michael greets you like an old friend, and together you tell Brother Thomas's story to a wider audience. How a 14th century monk physician brought Eastern movement practices to European knights, adapting ancient wisdom to serve new needs. In the Hall of Restoration, now carefully restored to how it might have appeared in Brother Thomas's day, you demonstrate some of the manuscript's basic sequences. The afternoon light streams through the eastern windows, just as it would have 7 centuries ago, falling on bodies moving in patterns that connect past and present in a dance of rediscovered knowledge. What Brother Thomas understood, you explain, to the camera, is that the human body has certain fundamental needs regardless of time, culture, or context. Whether you're a 14th century knight or a 21st century office worker, your spine, shoulders, and hips function according to the same principles. His genius was recognizing universal physical wisdom and translating it into terms his contemporaries could accept and apply. The documentary heirs to considerable interest, and your subsequent book, The Knight's Path, Medieval Movement Practices Rediscovered, finds an audience beyond academic circles. You begin receiving invitations to speak at both historical conferences and yoga retreats, bridging worlds much as Brother Thomas once did. On a crisp autumn morning a year after your first visit to St. Albans, you find yourself leading a workshop in the Abbey grounds. The participants include historians, martial artists, yoga instructors, and military veterans, all drawn by the story of how ancient wisdom crossed continents and centuries to serve those who carried the heaviest physical burdens of their age. As you guide them through movements first described by Brother Thomas, adapted for bodies that have never worn armor or wielded swords, you sense his presence like a gentle approval. In the rustling leaves, in the abbey bells marking the hours, in the timeless mechanics of breath and movement, his work continues. The manuscript itself now resides in a climate-controlled case, preserved for future generations, but its true legacy lives in motion, in bodies discovering what Brother Thomas knew, that strength without flexibility breaks, that breath connects body and mind, that ancient wisdom serves present needs when approached with respect and understanding. And, in the quiet moments between your teaching and research, you sometimes return alone to the Hall of Restoration. There, in the same space where wounded knights once learned to rebuild their strength and find their center, you practice the sequences that span centuries. With each mindful movement, each deliberate breath, you honor both the Eastern sages who first developed these practices and the Western healer who recognized their universal value. In those moments, time feels less like a linear progression and more like a spiral, bringing ancient wisdom back around to meet modern needs. Brother Thomas's voice seems to whisper in the stone walls. The body knows. It remembers what the mind forgets. Listen to its wisdom. This part of your dream has ended, but your journey through history continues. Beneath weathered stone and forgotten passageways, ancient wisdom waits in darkness. Torchlight once illuminated warriors learning disciplines older than their empire. Movements preserving both body and spirit through the collapse of civilizations. You descend the narrow, stone staircase, your hand tracing the cool, damp wall for balance. The torches carried by your guide cast dancing shadows that seem to whisper secrets of the past. The air grows cooler with each step, carrying the scent of earth and ancient stone. This hidden passage beneath the Palace of Aachen was not in any historical record you studied before arriving here as a visiting scholar. Yet the head archaeologist insisted you see it personally. "We discovered this chamber quite by accident," explains Dr. Miller, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "We were cataloguing the known crypts when ground-penetrating radar revealed this separate complex. Carbon dating suggests it was sealed during renovations around 820 CE, just after Charlemagne's death." The stairway opens into a rounded antechamber, its walls lined with niches that once held oil lamps. Faded frescoes cover the curved ceiling, figures in various poses that immediately catch your attention with their familiarity. "These are what prompted me to contact you specifically," Dr. Müller says, raising her torch higher to illuminate the ancient paintings. "Given your research on physical disciplines across cultures," you step closer, breathless with excitement and disbelief. The frescoes depict men, clearly warriors based on their muscular builds, performing what any modern observer would immediately recognize as yoga-like postures. Some stand in perfect warrior poses, others demonstrate backbends, forward, folds, and balancing positions. Interspersed among these figures are Greek letters and Latin phrases, partially faded but still legible. "This can't be what it appears to be," you murmur, though the evidence before your eyes suggests otherwise. Dr. Müller smiles. "That was my first reaction as well. But come, there's more." She leads you through an arched doorway into a larger chamber that takes your breath away. The ceiling rises to create a dome-like space, purposefully designed for physical movement. The floor is smooth stone, worn in circular patterns suggesting regular use. Recesses in the walls once held wooden bars and supports. Most remarkably, the entire circumference is painted with a continuous band of instructional images, dozens of human figures demonstrating a sophisticated system of movement disciplines. "We believe this was a training chamber for Charlemagne's personal guard, his most elite warriors," Dr. Müller explains, her voice hushed with appropriate reverence for the discovery. "But the practices depicted here are clearly not Germanic, or even conventionally Roman. They appear to be systematic adaptations of much older traditions." You move slowly around the chamber, studying the painted figures with growing amazement. The sequence begins with breathing exercises, clearly illustrated with visual metaphors of bellows and flowing water. It progresses through standing positions, focused on balance and strength, flowing movements resembling modern vinyasas, seated postures for flexibility, and concludes with what appear to be meditation instructions. The Latin inscriptions refer to this system as Disciplina Romana Antiqua, the ancient Roman discipline, Dr. Müller continues. But the accompanying Greek text suggests these practices were already considered ancient during the Roman period, preserved by certain military units and philosophical schools from even older sources. You trace your fingers lightly over one particularly clear inscription. "The warrior who neglects inner strength will fail when outer strength falters," you translate aloud. This sounds more like Eastern philosophy than Roman military doctrine. Exactly, Dr. Müller nods, which raises fascinating questions about cross-cultural transmission of these practices. The conventional history tells us yoga developed independently in India, yet here we have something remarkably similar being practiced by elite European warriors over 1,000 years ago. The torchlight flickers across the ancient images, bringing momentary life to warriors long turned to dust. In that dancing light, You can almost see them moving through these postures, breathing with deliberate control, finding center before marching forth to defend an empire. There's a third chamber, Dr. Müller says, guiding you toward another doorway. This final room is smaller, but even more revealing. Its walls are lined with shelves that once held scrolls and codices, a specialized library dedicated to these practices. Though the texts themselves are long gone, taken when the chambers were sealed or deteriorated over the centuries, the stone tablets mounted above each shelf section remain, indicating their contents. Teachings from the Greek physician. You read from one tablet. Exercises for winter campaigns. Recovery after battle. Breathing for courage. Postures to counter the weight of armor. And this one is particularly interesting. Dr. Müller points to a prominent tablet. It translates roughly as the system of Alexander's Eastern teacher. You turn to her, mind racing with implications. Alexander the Great studied with Eastern philosophers during his campaigns in India and Persia. Historical accounts mention his interest in their practices. Precisely, she nods. What if some of those teachings, specifically the physical disciplines, were brought back to Greece and later incorporated into Roman military training? What if, while we've been treating yoga as an exclusively Eastern development, similar practices were being preserved in specialized Western contexts? A chill runs through you that has nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. If authentic, this discovery could rewrite our understanding of cultural exchange in the ancient world and the history of physical disciplines. Dr. Müller gives you space to absorb the chamber's significance, moving to examine some details of the stonework. You walk slowly around the room, piecing together a historical narrative from these fragments. The presence of such a facility beneath Charlemagne's palace suggests these practices weren't merely preserved as historical curiosities. They were actively taught to elite warriors during a period when the Frankish king was consciously reviving Roman traditions and institutions. Charlemagne, who proclaimed himself emperor and sought to rebuild Roman glory, would have valued ancient military disciplines that proved effective. Have you found any documents referencing these chambers or practices? You ask, finally breaking your contemplative silence. Only indirectly, Dr. Müller replies. Einhard's biography of Charlemagne mentions the emperor practicing ancient exercises for health regularly, despite his courtiers finding them unusual. And there are payment records for a master of physical disciplines among the court expenditures. She leads you back to the main training chamber, where your research assistant has begun carefully photographing the frescoes under the supervision of the site's conservator. The methodical documentation process will take weeks, but eventually will allow for detailed analysis of every figure, every inscription. What strikes me most, you observe, watching the ancient images emerge with new clarity under your assistant's careful lighting, is how practical this system appears. These aren't ritualistic or symbolic positions. They're clearly designed to address specific physical needs of warriors: spinal alignment, shoulder mobility, hip flexibility, balance, controlled breathing under stress. Form follows function, Dr. Müller agrees. Whether developed in India, Greece, or elsewhere, the human body has the same basic mechanics and limitations. Warriors throughout history face similar physical challenges, carrying heavy equipment, enduring long marches, maintaining calm under threat. It makes sense that they might independently develop similar solutions. You nod thoughtfully. Yet the specificity here argues against completely independent development. Look at the sequencing, the progression from standing to seated postures, the integration of breath work. This isn't just a collection of useful stretches, it's a comprehensive system. As the day progresses, you begin mapping the chamber's complete pictorial sequence. The frescoes tell a story of systematic training, beginning with purification practices, clearly labeled in Latin as preparatio, progressing through increasingly challenging physical postures, called firmitas, stability, strength, and concluding with what modern practitioners would recognize as pranayama and meditation, labeled spiritus imperium, mastery of breath trans spirit. Dr. Müller arranges for meals to be brought down, unwilling to interrupt this first crucial day of documentation. As you eat simple sandwiches beneath frescoes of ancient warriors in perfect embodiments of strength and flexibility, she shares the broader context of the discovery. Charlemagne's court was a fascinating confluence of traditions, she explains. He gathered scholars from across Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and even had diplomatic contact with the Abbasid Caliphate. He was explicitly trying to revive classical learning while synthesizing it with Christian frameworks, creating a new Roman Empire that built upon rather than merely imitated the old, you add. Exactly. And these chambers suggest that revival included physical disciplines that had been preserved through the so-called Dark Ages in specialized contexts, likely elite military units and philosophical schools that maintained continuous traditions despite the empire's political collapse. The implication is staggering, that what we now recognize as yoga-like practices may have been part of Western martial traditions for centuries, preserved in specialized lineages, while mainstream history focused on battles, politics, and religious developments. As afternoon fades into evening, you find yourself drawn to a particular section of the frescoes, one showing a bearded instructor guiding a younger warrior through what appears to be a sun salutation sequence. The Latin inscription beside it reads, "Movements to greet the day as taught by the sage Apollonius." Apollonius of Tyana, you breathe, excitement quickening your pulse. A Neo-Pythagorean philosopher who traveled extensively in India around 44 to 49 CE. Historical accounts mention he returned with Eastern practices, but most scholars assumed these were purely philosophical or mystical teachings. Dr. Müller joins you, studying the image with fresh interest. If Apollonius brought back physical practices as well, and if these were adopted by certain Roman circles, it would create a direct transmission line from ancient Indian yoga to Roman military disciplines. You complete her thought. And from there, preserved through specialized training, to Charlemagne's elite forces, that evening, by the light of modern lamps now installed in the ancient chamber, you and Dr. Müller begin drafting what will undoubtedly become a controversial research paper. The existence of yoga-like practices in 9th century Francia challenges conventional narratives about the isolation of Eastern and Western physical traditions. Before leaving the chamber for the night, something compels you to try one of the sequences depicted on the walls. You assume the opening stance. Feet firmly planted, spine erect, shoulders relaxed but engaged. Hands positioned precisely as shown in the fresco. The position feels immediately familiar to your body, despite the centuries separating you from those who last practiced it in this very space. Dr. Müller, rather than finding this unprofessional, joins you. We should understand these as movement practices, not just as historical artifacts, she says, mirroring your position. Together, following the ancient guidance painted on the walls, you move through a basic sequence. The chamber's dimensions suddenly make new sense. It was designed precisely for this practice, with enough space for perhaps 10 warriors to move without restriction. The acoustics create a subtle resonance that enhances the sound of controlled breathing. Even the height of the ceiling accommodates the full extension of arms in certain postures. When you complete the sequence, ending in a position of centered stillness, the connection across time feels almost tangible. For a moment, you stand where Charlemagne's warriors once stood, breathing as they breathed, finding strength and balance through the same disciplined movements. It works, Dr. Müller says simply, relaxing from the final position. Whatever they called it, however they understood it, it works. Over the following weeks, as the documentation of the chambers continues, you divide your time between academic analysis and experiential research, learning the system as depicted to understand it from the inside out. Each sequence reveals its purpose through practice, movements designed to counter the physical strain of bearing shields and swords, postures that release tension from hips and lower backs, compressed by long hours on horseback, breathing techniques to maintain calm focus during battle's chaos. Word of the discovery spreads through academic circles, bringing specialists from various fields, classical historians, art conservators, military historians, and yes, yoga scholars. The initial skepticism gradually gives way to fascinated acceptance as the evidence proves impossible to dismiss. A Byzantine historian identifies similar imagery and fragments from Constantinople, suggesting these practices spread eastward as well as westward. A specialist in Roman Britain finds tantalizing references in excavated writing tablets from military outposts along Hadrian's Wall. The pieces of a forgotten history begin to assemble. 6 months after the initial discovery, you stand in the chamber with a small group of invited guests, scholars from both Western and Eastern traditions, including a renowned yoga master from India. The chamber has been carefully preserved, the frescoes stabilized, subtle lighting installed that mimics the original oil lamps without damaging the ancient pigments. The yoga master moves slowly around the room, studying each figure with careful attention. His expression shifts from scholarly interest to profound recognition. "These are not merely similar to our traditions," he says finally. "They are our traditions, spoken in a different dialect of movement. See here, this is Virabhadrasana, warrior pose, though they name it differently. And here is what we would call Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog. The alignment principles are identical," he demonstrates, assuming the position shown in one of the frescoes with perfect precision. The living posture and the ancient painting align so exactly that it creates a momentary vertigo, as though time itself has folded, bringing ancient Rome and modern India into direct conversation. "What does this mean for the history of yoga?" you ask him. He considers thoughtfully before answering. "It suggests that the exchange of wisdom between East and West has roots far deeper than our conventional histories acknowledge. Perhaps we should speak not of Eastern and Western traditions, but of human traditions that have flowed back and forth across artificial boundaries for millennia." As your research continues, you work with Dr. Müller to create a comprehensive translation of all the chamber's texts and a detailed analysis of the movement system they contain. You collaborate with movement specialists to recreate the full practice sequence, documenting its effects on modern bodies trained for different purposes than warfare. The system, as preserved in Charlemagne's secret chamber, reveals itself as a sophisticated approach to warrior conditioning that integrates physical training, breath control, and mental discipline. Modern kinesiologists confirm that the sequence effectively addresses the specific physical challenges faced by heavily armored fighters, precisely countering the imbalances created by sword-bearing, shield-carrying, and horseback riding. When your findings are finally published, they generate intense debate across multiple disciplines. Some traditionalists reject the evidence, unwilling to accept that yoga might have a more complex cross-cultural history than previously believed. Others embrace it as proof of humanity's shared wisdom, of parallel discoveries and continuous exchange across supposed civilizational divides. For you, the most profound moment comes a year after the discovery, when the chambers are finally opened for limited scholarly access. You bring a group of military veterans who have been using adaptive yoga for recovery from combat injuries. In the ancient training space of Charlemagne's warriors, these modern soldiers move through sequences nearly identical to those depicted on the walls. One veteran, a former infantry officer with significant back trauma, studies the frescoes with tears in his eyes. They knew, he says simply. They understood what warfare does to the human body, and they developed specific counters for it. And somehow, we forgot. But not entirely forgotten, you reflect as you watch these modern warriors move through ancient disciplines. The knowledge, submerged but never disappeared entirely, preserved in various traditions that maintain these practices for their proven effectiveness. What Charlemagne's warriors called disciplina romana antiqua, what modern practitioners call yoga, what other traditions have named with their own terms. These are all dialects of the same fundamental understanding of human embodiment. In Naya, the cool silence of the underground chamber, as afternoon light filters down through newly installed light wells that mimic the original design, you watch the past and present merge in flowing movement. The warriors on the walls and the warriors on the floor mirror each other across 1,000 years, united by the timeless wisdom of the body. And in that moment, you understand that this discovery isn't just about rewriting history books or challenging cultural narratives. It's about recovering a shared heritage of embodied knowledge that transcends the artificial boundaries we've drawn between traditions. East and West, ancient and modern, spiritual and martial, the categories blur and dissolve in the fundamental truth of human movement. Before leaving the chamber, you place your hand against a section of wall where countless hands before yours have rested, the stone subtly polished by this repeated contact over centuries. The cool surface connects you to those unknown warriors who once stood in this space, breathing with deliberate control, finding their center before carrying the weight of armor and weapons into an uncertain world. Their practices, preserved through Charlemagne's vision and sealed away for 12 centuries, now breathe again in the modern world, not as historical curiosities, but as living traditions that continue to serve the same fundamental human needs. For strength tempered by flexibility, for power guided by breath, for outer skill rooted in inner stillness. As you climb the stairs, back to the world above, you carry with you not just academic knowledge, but embodied understanding, the felt recognition that wisdom flows across cultures and centuries when it serves truth about the human condition. What was preserved beneath Charlemagne's palace was not just a training system, but a testament to our shared heritage of discovering how to inhabit our bodies with greater awareness, strength, and grace. And in that recognition lies the true significance of the chamber and its ancient practices, not as evidence for academic arguments about cultural priority or independent development, but as a reminder that human beings have always sought and found paths to physical harmony, passing that knowledge forward through centuries of political change, cultural exchange, and historical forgetting. This moment fades softly now. Let's continue on, deeper into the past, where golden sands meet endless sky, where time moves to the rhythm of shifting dunes. Ancient wisdom found sanctuary in the souls of those who sought stillness amidst a world in tumult. You awaken before dawn in your simple cell carved from the limestone cliff. The desert air is cool against your skin, a brief respite before the sun reclaims its dominion over the Egyptian landscape. Around you, the monastery of St. Anthony slumbers in the pre-dawn darkness, its white walls gleaming faintly under the stars. You have been granted rare permission to stay among the monks during your research into early Christian ascetic practices. But what you discovered yesterday in the monastery's ancient library has transformed your academic pursuit into something far more profound. Wrapping a woolen shawl around your shoulders against the morning chill, you make your way to the eastern courtyard where Abba Makarios awaits. The elderly monk sits cross-legged on a woven mat, his silhouette motionless against the lightening horizon. At 83, his body maintains a suppleness that belies his age, his spine as straight as a desert palm. "You have come," he says, simply, not turning to look as you approach. His English carries the musical cadence of his native Coptic, words flowing like water over ancient stones. "Thank you for agreeing to teach me," you reply, taking your place on the mat he has set out. "For you, not teach," he corrects gently, "share. What belongs to no single tradition belongs to all who seek with honest hearts." The sky begins its transformation from indigo to pale gold as Abba Makarios guides you through the first movement sequence. What the manuscript you discovered yesterday calls the awakening of the warrior's body. Your academic mind catalogues the similarities to sun salutations in modern yoga, while your body responds to instructions that feel simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar. "Breathe from the center," Makarios instructs, demonstrating how to draw breath deep into the abdomen. As your lungs fill, imagine light rising from earth to heaven through your spine. As you exhale, heaven's blessing flows downward. The body becomes the meeting place of worlds. The movements are precise, deliberate, arms extending with palms upturned, spine arching backward to open the chest, then forward fold, hands touching the earth, stepping back into a position reminiscent of a plank, lowering with controlled strength, pressing up with aligned arms, arching the spine backward while face lifts toward the emerging sun. "This is how our fathers have begun each day since this monastery's founding," Makarios explains as you complete the sequence. 15. Centuries of continuous practice. What astonishes you is not just the antiquity of these movements, but their presence here in a Christian monastery in the Egyptian desert. Yesterday's discovery, a 5th century manuscript entitled "The Discipline of Soldiers of Christ," revealed something scholars had never suspected: that early Christian desert fathers preserved and adapted physical practices originating with Roman soldiers who had themselves learned them during Alexander's campaigns in the East. The manuscript speaks of a Roman centurion named Maximianus, you say, as Abba Makarios guides you into the second sequence. It says he brought these practices to the desert fathers after his conversion. The old monk smiles, adjusting your arm position slightly. Weight in the heels, strength flowing up through the core. Yes, Maximianus is part of our oral tradition as well. A commander in the imperial guard who encountered our father Anthony around 330 AD while pursuing a fugitive. Instead of completing his mission, he remained to learn the desert wisdom. You hold the position, feet planted firmly, knees bent, arms extended like wings, feeling the burn building in your thighs. The rising sun now paints the monastery walls gold and rose, casting long shadows across the courtyard's stone pavers. But Maximianus already knew body disciplines before his conversion. You continue, drawing from the manuscript's account. The text says he trained in what it calls the ancient method, practices preserved within certain elite Roman military units since the time of Alexander. Abba Makarios nods, his weathered face serene as he demonstrates the next movement. When Alexander's armies reached India, they encountered yogis whose physical mastery impressed even battle-hardened Macedonians. Some say Alexander himself studied with these masters. Whether true or not, certain practices returned westward with his troops. The sequence continues, each position flowing into the next with mindful transitions. What strikes you is the integration of strength, flexibility, and breath awareness. Elements found in modern yoga, but contextualized here within Christian desert spirituality. Roman military trainers recognized the practical benefits. Abba Makarios continues. Warriors who practiced these disciplines showed greater endurance, recovered more quickly from wounds, maintained clearer minds in battle chaos. Over generations, certain units preserved these methods, passing them from veteran to recruit as specialized knowledge. As the sequence concludes, other monks begin to appear in the courtyard, nodding respectfully to Abba Makarios before taking their places on simple mats. Soon, 24 men of various ages form neat rows, all facing the now risen sun. Without instruction, they begin moving through more complex variations of the sequences you've just learned. Maximianus recognized the spiritual potential in practices he had learned for military purposes. Abba Makarios explains quietly as you observe the monks. When he encountered Anthony and the other desert fathers, he saw men seeking the same inner strength and discipline, though for different battles. The monastery bell rings, calling the community to morning prayers. The monks complete their movement practice with a series of breathing exercises before filing silently toward the ancient chapel carved into the cliff face. Abba Makarios gestures for you to follow. The integration was not immediate or without controversy, he continues as you walk together across the sun-washed courtyard. Some brothers rejected these practices as pagan. Others embraced them as God-given tools for embodied prayer. The debate continued for generations. Inside the chapel, its walls covered with vibrant iconography dating back centuries, you notice something you missed during previous visits. Subtle depictions of monks in movement postures integrated into scenes of saints' lives. Now that you know what to look for, these visual references to the practice tradition appear throughout the monastery's ancient artwork. After the morning liturgy, Abba Makarios leads you to a small chamber adjacent to the library where you made your discovery. Unlike the main library with its carefully preserved manuscripts, this room appears to be a practical teaching space. Simple diagrams on parchment line the walls, showing human figures in various postures with Coptic annotations. For 15 centuries, we have maintained what we call the discipline of the awakened body. Abba Makarios explains. Each generation of monks learns the complete system, movement sequences for different times of day and seasons, breathing practices for various spiritual challenges, restorative postures for aging bodies. You study the diagrams with scholarly fascination and growing personal interest. The systematic nature of the practice becomes clearer. Progressive sequences, building from simple to complex. Adaptations for different body types and conditions. Integration with the monastic daily rhythm. What most scholars don't understand about desert monasticism, Abba Makarios continues, is that it was never about rejecting the body, but about redeeming it. Our fathers understood that embodied existence is not an obstacle to spiritual life, but its very medium. These practices help them inhabit their bodies with greater awareness, transforming physical discipline into spiritual attentiveness. Throughout the day, between the monastery's regular cycles of work and prayer, Abba Makarios continues your instruction. In a shaded courtyard, during the heat of midday, he teaches you cooling breath practices that desert fathers used to endure the extreme temperatures. Before the evening meal, you learn sequences designed to aid digestion and promote moderate appetite. The genius of our tradition, he explains while demonstrating a gentle twisting posture, was recognizing that practices originating in one context could serve another. What Roman soldiers used for martial effectiveness, desert ascetics adapted for spiritual warfare. The enemy changed, no longer human adversaries but inner passions and demons of distraction. Yet the need for disciplined presence remained the same. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, Abba Makarios leads you to a small plateau above the monastery where weathered stones form a natural circle. Several elder monks have gathered there, sitting in contemplative silence as the desert transforms in the golden afternoon light. This is where we practice the sequence of stillness, he explains, indicating a flat stone where you should sit. While morning practices awaken energy, evening practices cultivate tranquility. Under his guidance and that of the other elders, you learn seated positions designed to support extended meditation, subtle movements that release the day's accumulated tension, and breath patterns that quiet the mind. These practices feel particularly ancient, as though reaching back beyond even Alexander's time to forgotten wisdom. As twilight deepens into night, the temperature dropping rapidly as desert heat radiates back into the clear sky, one of the oldest monks, Abba Yusef, who rarely speaks, addresses the group in Coptic. Abba Makarios translates for you. He says that what we preserve here is not ours alone. It belongs to the heritage of embodied wisdom that has flowed between East and West, between traditions and faiths, preserved by those who experienced its value directly. The outer forms change, the names, the contexts, the explanations, but the essential understanding of human embodiment remains. That night, returning to your simple cell, you reflect on how this discovery challenges conventional academic boundaries. The manuscript you found doesn't merely document an interesting historical curiosity. It evidences a continuous tradition that connects Roman military disciplines, Eastern yogic practices, and Christian desert spirituality in ways previously unimagined. Sleep comes easily after the day's physical practice, and your dreams are vivid. Images of Roman soldiers training under eastern skies, of desert fathers moving through dawn sequences on sand-swept plateaus, of generations of monks preserving embodied wisdom through centuries of political upheaval and religious change. You awaken again before dawn, your body somehow knowing the rhythm of the monastery even after just one day. This time, you make your way to the eastern courtyard without guidance, finding Abba Makarios and several other monks already preparing for their morning practice. As the sky lightens, Abba Makarios invites you not just to observe, but to join fully in the community's practice. The sequences feel both familiar and new, your body remembering yesterday's lessons, while discovering subtleties not apparent at first experience. Notice how the body becomes more receptive with each cycle. Abba Makarios murmurs as you move through the third repetition. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. The wisdom enters slowly, through daily faithfulness rather than occasional effort. After breakfast, simple bread, olives, and tea shared in contemplative silence, Abba Makarios takes you deeper into the monastery complex, to areas not shown to ordinary visitors. A narrow passage cut into the limestone leads to a series of caves that predate the monastery itself. Our earliest fathers lived in these caves before any structures were built, he explains, his voice echoing slightly in the cool darkness. Here, the tradition was first shaped into its Christian form. The largest cave opens into a natural chamber where light filters down through a crack in the ceiling. Simple crosses and early Christian symbols are carved into the walls alongside. Something more surprising: outlines of human figures in various movement postures, crude but recognizable ancestors of the practices you're learning. According to our tradition, Abba Makarios says, when Maximianus the centurion joined the Desert Fathers, he found them already practicing certain physical disciplines derived from ancient Egyptian traditions. What he contributed was the systematic method preserved in Roman military training, the structured sequences, the progressive development, the understanding of how different postures address specific conditions of body and mind. You trace the ancient carvings with careful fingers, feeling the connection across centuries. So it was a true synthesis: Egyptian, Indian via Greek and Roman influences, and early Christian spiritual practices. As with much of Alexandria's wisdom in that golden age, Abba Makarios nods. Egypt has always been a crossroads of cultures. What emerged here was not simple borrowing, but creative integration, taking practices developed in various contexts and unifying them within a new understanding of embodied spiritual life. Throughout your remaining days at the monastery, you divide your time between academic documentation and experiential learning. You photograph the manuscript and related artifacts, make detailed notes on the oral tradition as shared by Abba Makarios and other elder monks, and continue learning the physical practices themselves. On your final evening, sitting again with the elders on the plateau above the monastery, you ask the question that has been forming throughout your stay. Why has this tradition remained unknown to scholars? Why isn't it recognized as part of the history of embodied practices, alongside yoga and other systems? Abba Youssef responds in Coptic, speaking longer than usual, his weathered hands occasionally forming shapes that illustrate his words. Abba Makarios translates. He says there have been periods when our tradition was more widely shared, and periods when it was deliberately protected. During the early Islamic conquests, when many Christian practices were viewed with suspicion, the physical discipline was taught only within monastery walls. During periods of persecution, manuscripts were hidden or, in some cases, deliberately written to disguise the practice as mere physical exercise rather than integrated spiritual discipline. But more importantly, he says, this wisdom has always been transmitted person to person, body to body, not primarily through texts. Books explain and contextualize, but the true teaching happens in practice. This is why scholars who study only texts often miss living traditions that exist alongside them. As the stars emerge in the desert sky, more numerous and brilliant than you've ever seen them, Abba Makarios adds, what matters is not academic recognition, but faithful preservation. These practices have served generations of monks not because they are historically interesting, but because they work. They facilitate the integration of body and spirit that our Christian life requires. The next morning, preparing for departure, you feel both the scholar's excitement at a significant discovery and the practitioner's reluctance to leave a transformative experience. Abba Makarios meets you at the monastery gate, bringing a simple gift, a small, hand-bound book containing the basic practice sequences rendered in both Coptic and English. For continued practice, he says with a gentle smile. Remember, consistency matters more than intensity. As your driver navigates the rough desert track back toward Cairo, you watch the white walls of St. Anthony's Monastery recede in the distance, an unbroken tradition stretching back 15 centuries, preserving embodied wisdom that flowed westward with Alexander's armies, was systematized in Roman military training, and found spiritual purpose among Christian desert ascetics. Back at your university, your findings generate both excitement and controversy. Some colleagues dismiss the connection between Roman military practices and Eastern yogic traditions as speculative, despite the manuscript evidence. Others question whether the monastery's current practices truly represent an unbroken tradition, rather than more recent reconstructions. But as weeks pass, additional evidence emerges supporting your discovery. A Byzantine military manual dated to the 6th century references similar practices for elite units. Mosaics in Sicily depict Roman soldiers in recognizable postures. A monastery in Greece produces its own tradition of the warrior's discipline, preserved since the 9th century. You maintain correspondence with Abba Makarios, who responds to your academic updates with gentle amusement. Truth does not require universal recognition to remain true, he writes. What matters is that the wisdom continues to serve those who receive it. Each morning, before beginning your academic work, you unroll a simple mat in your office and practice the sequences learned at St. Anthony's. Your body remembers what your mind still struggles to fully articulate. That these movements connect you not just to your own physicality, but to a lineage of embodied wisdom that transcends the categories of East and West, ancient and modern, spiritual and practical. 6 months after your visit, you return to Egypt leading a small research team that includes scholars of comparative religion, movement specialists, and historians of ancient military practices. The monastery welcomes you back, and Abba Makarios, seemingly unchanged despite the passing months, greets you with knowing eyes. You have been practicing, he observes simply. Over the following weeks, your team documents the tradition in greater detail, recording the complete practice system, interviewing elder monks about its transmission, analyzing the philosophical and theological frameworks that have contextualized these physical practices within Christian desert spirituality across 15 centuries. What emerges is a profound reconsideration of how embodied wisdom has flowed across cultural boundaries throughout history. The neat divisions between Eastern and Western physical traditions begin to dissolve when viewed through the lens of this continuously practiced tradition that bears markers of multiple origins, yet functions as an integrated whole. On your final evening at the monastery during this second visit, Abba Makarios leads you and your team to a small chapel rarely used for regular services. By lamplight, he shows you icons dating to the 8th century that depict saints and angels in postures clearly related to the movement practice. Visual evidence of how thoroughly these physical disciplines were integrated into the spiritual imagination of early desert Christianity. What we preserve is not merely ancient, but timeless, Abba Makarios says, as you study the sacred images. Not Eastern or Western, but human. The body's wisdom transcends the boundaries we create in our minds. As you prepare once again to leave the desert sanctuary that has transformed your understanding, you realize that your discovery is valuable, not just for rewriting history, but for reconnecting divided streams of human wisdom. What the monks of St. Anthony's Monastery have preserved is evidence that the embodied practices now often associated exclusively with Eastern traditions were once part of a shared heritage that flowed freely between cultures, serving warriors and mystics alike in their quest for integrated strength and presence. In the pre-dawn darkness of your final day, you join the monks one last time in the eastern courtyard. As your body moves through the now familiar sequences, greeting the sun as it has been greeted by practitioners in this place for 15 centuries, you feel yourself part of something both ancient and immediate, a continuing conversation between body and spirit, between East and West, between past and present. The desert stretches vast and timeless around the monastery walls, witness to countless cycles of practice, preservation, and rediscovery as the sun breaks the horizon, painting the landscape gold, just as it did for Roman centurions, desert fathers, and generations of monks who moved through these same practices on this same ground. You understand that some wisdom belongs not to any single tradition, but to humanity's shared heritage, preserved through dedicated practice, when it might otherwise have been lost to time's passage. And in that understanding comes a responsibility, not just to document this tradition academically, but to participate in its living continuation, to be part of the human chain that ensures embodied wisdom remains available to future generations, transcending the artificial boundaries of discipline, culture, and faith that too often divide what was meant to be shared. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us, drifting through forgotten echoes of history. If this story brought you peace, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs rest. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Until next time, sleep well, dream softly, and good night.